The woman standing in the middle of Tucumcari's dusty square had eyes like flint and hands that moved through yarn the way other people breathed. Aria Morgan had arrived in the New Mexico Territory town 3 weeks ago with nothing but the clothes on her back, a broken wagon wheel, and enough determination to build a house from sand if she had to. The desert sun beat down mercilessly in the summer of 1882, turning the packed earth beneath her feet into something close to iron. She sat on an overturned crate outside the general store, her fingers never stopping their constant motion, as she wove another blanket from the wool she'd managed to trade for 2 days prior. The rhythm soothed something restless inside her, the same restlessness that had driven her west from Kansas after her father died and left her with nothing but debts and hungry creditors. The blanket taking shape across her lap was beautiful in its simplicity. Deep blues and warm earth tones intersected in patterns she'd learned from her mother, who'd learned them from a traveling woman years ago. Aria had always possessed quick fingers and an eye for color, but necessity had turned a pleasant hobby into her only means of survival. She needed bread. She needed shelter. She needed 100 things that required money she didn't have, but she had these blankets, and in a town where nights still carried the mountain's chill even in summer, blankets held value. A shadow fell across her work, and Aria looked up into the weathered face of Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband. The older woman's expression was sympathetic but firm. "That's a beautiful piece," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd grown up further east. "But John says we've already got more blankets than we can sell this season. Can't trade you bread for it today, dear." Aria's stomach clenched. She'd eaten nothing but weak broth for 2 days, saving the last of her flour for when she truly had no other option. "I could take less bread. Half a loaf would do me fine." Mrs. Henderson's face softened further, which somehow made it worse. Pity was a currency Aria had no interest in collecting. "I'm sorry, truly. But with the railroad bringing in factory goods from back east, folks want to buy the cheaper options. Your work is finer, but fine doesn't fill bellies when times are tight for everyone." The woman retreated into the store, and Aria sat there with the half-finished blanket growing warm in the afternoon heat. Her fingers had stilled for the first time in hours. The practical part of her mind was already calculating how much longer she could survive, how many meals she could skip before her hands started shaking too badly to weave. The stubborn part, the part that had gotten her through her father's death and the long journey west, simply refused to consider failure. "That's some fine work." The voice was male, low and rough like stones tumbling in a river. Aria turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, hat in his hands. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent more time working than eating, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes so deeply brown they were nearly black. Dust covered his clothes, the kind that spoke of long days on horseback, and he moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to his body as a tool. He looked perhaps 25, not much older than Aria's own 22 years. "Thank you," she said, her voice cool. She'd learned quickly that Western towns were full of men who thought a woman alone was an invitation. "But I'm not looking for compliments." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Wasn't offering charity. I need a blanket. My bedroll wore through last week and I've been sleeping cold. You trading that one?" Aria's fingers tightened on the wool. "I'm trading for food. The general store won't take any more." He nodded slowly, considering. "What if I bought you food and you traded me the blanket for it?" Same as if the store was the middleman. It was logical, practical, exactly the kind of solution she needed, yet something made her hesitate. Why not just buy a blanket from the store, probably cheaper than what I need? Already looked. They've got thin factory things that won't last a season of hard use. You make that yourself. I did. Then I want that one. A thing made with skill is worth more than something stamped out by a machine. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was stating something as obvious as the sun's position in the sky. How much food would the store have traded you? Aria named a sum that would have gotten her bread, some beans, and a bit of salt pork. The man nodded and walked into the general store without another word. She sat there, uncertain whether to wait or leave, her hands resuming their weaving from pure habit. He emerged 10 minutes later with a canvas sack that looked promisingly full. "More than you asked for," he said, setting it down beside her crate. "But you look like you could use it, and I need that blanket finished. When can you have it done?" "2 days. I'll be at the stable on the north end of town. Name's Vincent Faulkner." He settled his hat back on his head, and Aria caught a glimpse of old scars on his knuckles, the kind that came from hard work or harder fights. "Don't worry about finding me. I'll find you." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her with the food and a dozen questions. Aria looked into the sack and found not just what she'd named but coffee, flour, dried apples, and a small tin of honey. It was more than a fair trade. It was generous to the point of being suspicious. She gathered her things and carried them back to the tiny room she'd rented above the seamstress shop, her mind working through possibilities. Vincent Faulkner hadn't looked at her the way most men did. There'd been no calculation in his gaze, no assessment of her as anything other than someone who could make what he needed. It had been refreshingly direct, but Aria hadn't survived this long by taking things at face value. Still, that night she ate real food for the first time in days, and when she lay down to sleep, her stomach was full enough that she could ignore the ache of loneliness that came with the darkness. The next 2 days passed in a blur of weaving. Aria's fingers flew through the pattern, creating something sturdy enough for trail life but beautiful enough to satisfy her own standards. She added extra thickness to the weave, knowing that a cowboy sleeping under stars would need real warmth when autumn came. The work consumed her attention so fully that she barely noticed the passage of time until the blanket was finished. She found Vincent at the stable as promised, tending to a roan horse with the careful attention of someone who understood that their life might one day depend on their mount's health. He looked up at her approach, and she saw him register the finished blanket over her arm. "You do good work fast," he said, running his hands over the wool when she passed it to him. "This will last me years." "It should. I don't make things that fall apart." Aria meant it as simple fact, but Vincent smiled, a quick flash that transformed his serious features into something younger and more open. "I believe it. You got plans for more work, or was this a one-time trade? I'll make whatever people will buy." "Why?" Vincent folded the blanket with surprising care. "There's a ranch about 15 miles west of here. The carpenter spread. Owner's wife just had her 4th baby, and I heard her mention needing blankets for the coming winter. Might be she'd trade with you or pay cash if you'd rather." "You heard her mention it. I work there sometimes. Pick up jobs where I can, moving cattle, breaking horses, fixing fence. Whatever needs doing." He said it without embarrassment, though Aria knew that kind of drifting work was often all that was available to men without land or family connections. "I could mention you to Mrs. Carpenter if you want. She's fair, and she appreciates good craftsmanship." Aria studied him, trying to understand the angle. "What do you get out of this?" "Nothing. You make blankets. She needs blankets. Seems simple enough." Vincent met her eyes steadily. "Not everything has to be complicated. In my experience, most things are." "Then maybe your experience has been with the wrong people." There was no judgment in his voice, just observation, but it struck something tender in Aria's chest. She thought of her father, who'd loved cards more than his daughter, of the men who'd circled after his death looking for opportunities in her vulnerability, of the long road west, where kindness had been rarer than water. Vincent's straightforward offer felt like a trick simply because it asked for nothing in return. "I'd appreciate the introduction," she said finally. "Thank you. I'm heading out there tomorrow morning early. You can ride with me if you want, save you the walk." Aria hesitated. Riding alone with a strange man into empty country was exactly the kind of risk she'd learned to avoid. But she'd also learned that caution without opportunity was just another word for starvation. "What time?" "Dawn. Meet me here." She nodded and left before she could second-guess herself further. That night, she barely slept, her mind spinning through scenarios both hopeful and dire. By the time the eastern sky started to pale, she'd convinced herself 3 times not to go, and 3 times talked herself back into it. She dressed in her most practical clothes, braided her dark hair into a tight plait, and walked to the stable as the town was just beginning to wake. Vincent was already there, his horse saddled and a second mount waiting beside it. The mare was older, gentle-eyed, with none of the skittishness that would have made Aria's limited riding skills a problem. "Borrowed her from the stable master," Vincent explained, checking the cinch on Aria's saddle. "Dolly here is steady as a rock. You ride much, some. It's been a while." "You'll be fine. We'll take it easy." They rode out as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Aria had expected awkward silence, but Vincent seemed content to let the quiet stretch between them, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. She found herself relaxing despite her intentions, her body remembering the sway of horseback even as her hands itched for yarn to keep them busy. "How long have you been in Tucumcari?" Vincent asked after they'd been riding for an hour. "3 weeks. You?" "I pass through every few months. Been working this territory for about 2 years now." "Where are you from originally?" Vincent was quiet for a moment. "St. Louis. Left when I was 16. You?" "Kansas. Left after my father died 6 months ago. I'm sorry. Don't be, he wasn't a good man." Aria surprised herself by saying it aloud. She'd kept that truth locked away, as if admitting her father's failures would somehow reflect badly on her. But the empty desert seemed to invite honesty, and Vincent's expression held no judgment. "My father wasn't either," he said simply. "Guess that's something we have in common." They rode on, and Aria felt something settle in her chest, some small knot of tension unwinding. The Carpenter Ranch appeared as a cluster of buildings shimmering in the mid-morning heat, substantial structures that spoke of years of work and success. Cattle dotted the distant hillsides, and the whole operation had an air of thriving permanence that made Aria's rootless existence feel suddenly more precarious. Mrs. Carpenter proved to be a robust woman in her 30s with flour on her apron and a baby on her hip. She welcomed them with the casual hospitality of someone accustomed to visitors, ushering them into a kitchen that smelled like fresh bread and coffee. 2 young children peeked around her skirts, curious about the strangers. "Vincent, good to see you," Mrs. Carpenter said warmly. "My husband mentioned you might stop by this week. Who's your friend?" "This is Aria Morgan. She's the weaver I mentioned. Makes the finest blankets in the territory." Mrs. Carpenter's eyes sharpened with interest, and Aria found herself explaining her work, her situation, and her hopes for building a customer base. The ranch wife listened carefully, asked intelligent questions about materials and durability, and finally nodded. "I need 6 blankets before winter. 4 for the children and 2 for the bunkhouse." Can you do that? Yes, madam. What would you want to pay? They negotiated a fair price, one that would actually give Aria some financial breathing room if she could deliver. Mrs. Carpenter even offered to provide the wool from their own sheep, which would save Aria considerable expense. By the time they rode back toward Tucumcari that afternoon, Aria had a real commission and the beginnings of hope that she might actually survive in this harsh country. "Thank you," she said to Vincent as the town came back into view. "You didn't have to do that. I know." "Why did you?" Vincent was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Because you reminded me of myself a couple years back. Proud and stubborn and determined not to fail even when everything was stacked against you. Someone helped me once when they didn't have to. Figure I should pass it along." "Who helped you?" "Old cowboy named Samuel Rivers. He was dying, knew it too, but he spent his last months teaching me everything he knew about horses and cattle and how to survive out here. Left me his tack and his bedroll and the only kindness I'd known in years." Vincent's voice went rough. "He died the winter I turned 18. I think about him often." Aria felt tears prick her eyes, surprising her with their sudden intensity. "He'd be proud of you, maybe. I try to live in a way that would make him not regret his time with me." They reached the stable, and Aria dismounted with legs stiff from the long ride. Vincent helped her down, his hands steadying her with casual strength, and for just a moment they stood close enough that she could smell dust and leather and something else, something purely him. Her breath caught, and she stepped back quickly, unsettled by her own reaction. "I should get back," she said. "I have a lot of work ahead of me." "Aria." He said her name like he was testing it out. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow? There's a decent restaurant on Main Street, nothing fancy, but the food is good." Her first instinct was to refuse. Getting tangled up with anyone, especially someone she'd have to see regularly if she stayed in Tucumcari, seemed like inviting trouble. But Vincent's dark eyes were hopeful and uncertain in a way that made him seem more human and less like the confident cowboy who'd first approached her. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because I'd like to know you better. Because I haven't had a conversation with someone that I actually enjoyed in longer than I can remember. Because you're interesting and talented and I find myself thinking about you when I should be focused on work." He said it all in a rush, like if he didn't get it all out at once he might lose his nerve. "But if you're not interested, that's fine too. No pressure." Aria considered. It had been so long since anyone had wanted to know her for herself rather than for what they could get from her. Vincent had already proven himself trustworthy, had helped her without asking for anything in return. And if she was honest, she was lonely. Desperately, achingly lonely in a way that had nothing to do with food or shelter and everything to do with the human need for connection. "Tomorrow evening," she said. "What time?" The smile that broke across Vincent's face was like sunrise. 6 o'clock. I'll meet you at your place. The seamstress shop on 2nd Street. I have a room above it. I'll find it." Aria walked back to her tiny room with her mind spinning. She had work to do, an enormous amount of work if she was going to fill Mrs. Carpenter's order on time. But underneath the practical concerns, there was something else. A flutter of anticipation that had nothing to do with blankets or survival and everything to do with the way Vincent had looked at her, like she was someone worth knowing. The next day passed in a blur of wool and pattern work. Aria threw herself into the weaving with single-minded focus, trying not to think about the coming evening. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, she found herself setting aside her work and staring at her limited wardrobe with a frustration born of having exactly 2 dresses to her name. She chose the better one, a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and braided her hair in a softer style than her usual tight plait. Vincent arrived exactly at 6, cleaned up and wearing a shirt that looked recently pressed. His hair was still damp from washing, and he held his hat in his hands like a man approaching something precious and potentially fragile. "You look beautiful," he said, and it sounded like simple truth rather than flattery. "Thank you. You look nice, too." They walked to the restaurant through streets just beginning to cool from the day's heat. Other people were out taking the evening air, and Aria was conscious of the looks they drew. A woman alone was always noticed, but a woman with a man drew different kinds of attention. She kept her head high, refusing to show any self-consciousness. The restaurant was modest but clean, with good smells drifting from the kitchen. Vincent held her chair with an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed natural rather than performed. They ordered beef and potatoes, and while they waited for the food, Vincent asked her about her weaving. "How did you learn?" "My mother taught me when I was young. She was talented, could make anything with her hands. She died when I was 12, and I kept up the weaving because it made me feel close to her." Aria found herself talking more freely than she usually did, drawn out by Vincent's genuine interest. "My father thought it was a waste of time, but it was the one thing of hers I had left." "What about your father? What happened to him?" "He drank and gambled. We were barely scraping by even before he got sick. When he died, I discovered he'd mortgaged everything we had and lost it besides. The bank took the house and I had nothing but debts." She met Vincent's eyes steadily. "I ran. Paid what I could and left the rest behind. Maybe that makes me a coward. It makes you a survivor. There's no shame in that." "Is that how you justify leaving St. Louis?" Vincent's expression went carefully neutral. "I didn't leave St. Louis, I escaped it. My father was a mean drunk who liked to use his fists. I stayed until my mother died, and then I ran the same way you did. Sometimes leaving is the only sane choice." Their food arrived, and they ate in companionable silence for a while. Aria found herself studying Vincent when she thought he wasn't looking. The scars on his knuckles, the weathered tan of someone who lived outdoors, the careful way he moved that spoke of old injuries or ingrained caution. He was handsome in a rough-hewn way, but what drew her was something deeper than appearance. There was a steadiness to him, a reliability that felt rare and valuable. "Tell me about Samuel Rivers," she said. "The man who helped you." Vincent's face softened. "He was maybe 60 when I met him, working as a horse breaker for a ranch in Colorado. I'd been drifting for about 6 months, taking whatever work I could get, barely surviving. He saw me trying to ride a horse that was way above my skill level and stopped me from getting killed. Instead of mocking me, he offered to teach me." "Why did he do it?" I asked him that once. "He said everyone deserves a chance to become who they're meant to be, and that teaching me gave him a purpose in his last days." Vincent's voice went soft. "He had a son who died in the war, never got to pass on what he knew. I think maybe I filled that empty space for him. You loved him." "I did. He was more of a father in 2 years than my actual father was in 16. Vincent looked at her directly. "Is that foolish? To love someone who wasn't blood?" "No. I think family is what we make it, not what we're born into." They talked until the restaurant began to empty, their conversation ranging from serious to playful and back again. Aria learned that Vincent could read and write, that he loved horses more than cattle, that he'd once spent 3 months in Montana and nearly froze to death. She told him about learning to read from her mother's Bible, about the journey west in a wagon that fell apart piece by piece, about her dreams of maybe one day having a shop of her own where she could sell her weavings. When they finally left, the night air was cool and the stars overhead were brilliant in their multitude. Vincent walked her back to the seamstress shop, and they stood outside in the darkness, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Can I see you again?" Vincent asked. I'd like that. I have to leave tomorrow for a week. There's a cattle drive heading north and they need an extra hand. But when I get back, maybe we could do this again. Maybe we could. Vincent smiled and then, moving slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, he leaned forward and kissed her cheek. It was the briefest touch, barely more than a brush of lips against skin, but it sent warmth flooding through Aria's entire body. Good night, Aria. Good night, Vincent. She watched him walk away until the darkness swallowed him, then climbed the stairs to her room with her heart beating faster than the climb warranted. She lay awake for a long time that night, her fingers moving through invisible patterns in the air, her mind full of dark eyes and unexpected kindness. The weak Vincent was gone past slowly. Aria threw herself into her work, making steady progress on Mrs. Carpenter's commission. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, wondering if he was safe, if he was thinking about her too. It felt dangerous to let someone matter this much after such a short time, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Other men in town had started to notice her, now that she'd been seen dining with Vincent. A few made offers, some crude and some more polite, but none of them interested her. She'd compare them to Vincent and find them lacking, which she knew was foolish but couldn't help. On the 8th day, she was sitting in her usual spot outside the general store, weaving and trying not to watch the road for returning riders. Mrs. Henderson came out with a cup of coffee for her, a peace offering after their earlier disagreement about trades. "That's Vincent Faulkner you've been seeing, isn't it?" the older woman asked, settling onto a nearby crate. "I've had dinner with him once, yes. He's a good man, drifts a lot, but he's honest and works hard. Could do a lot worse." "I'm not looking for a husband, Mrs. Henderson. I'm looking to survive. Sometimes those things go together." The older woman's expression was kind. "I came west as a bride 40 years ago, scared and alone except for John. This land is hard, dear. It's easier with someone beside you. I've managed on my own so far." "You have, and I admire that. But there's a difference between managing and thriving. Think on it." Mrs. Henderson went back inside, leaving Aria with her thoughts and her weaving. Was she being stubborn for the sake of stubbornness? She'd spent so long depending only on herself that the thought of relying on anyone else felt like weakness. But Vincent hadn't asked her to rely on him. He'd simply offered his company, his help, his interest in knowing her. She was still mulling it over when horses appeared on the western road. The cattle drive was returning, dusty and tired, and Aria found herself scanning the riders with her heart in her throat. She spotted Vincent toward the back, slumped slightly in his saddle with exhaustion, and relief flooded through her so powerfully it was almost frightening. He saw her and straightened, a smile breaking through the weariness on his face. He said something to the other riders and broke away, walking his horse over to where she sat. "You're a sight for sore eyes," he said, dismounting with a stiffness that spoke of long hours in the saddle. "You look exhausted." "I am, but I wanted to see you before I went to sleep for the next day and a half." He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Did you miss me?" Aria considered lying, maintaining her careful distance. Instead, she said, "Yes, I did." The joy that lit Vincent's face made her glad she'd told the truth. "I missed you too, thought about you every day." The other hands thought I was losing my mind, smiling at nothing. "You should go rest." "I will, but first, there's something I want to ask you." Vincent took a breath. "The ranch where I was working, they offered me a permanent position. Good pay, steady work, a bunk of my own. I'd stop drifting, stay in one place. I'm thinking about taking it." "That's wonderful, Vincent, you should. I'm only considering it because you're here." He said it plainly, no game playing or artifice. "I don't want to drift anymore if it means leaving you behind. But that's a big thing to admit after knowing someone for 2 weeks, and I don't want to scare you off. Aria set down her weaving and stood, moving close enough that she could see the darker flecks in his brown eyes. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You're not scaring me off. I've been thinking about you too, more than I probably should have. So if I take this job, if I stay in Tucumcari, would you want to keep seeing me? Proper courting, the kind that might lead somewhere." "Yes," Aria said. "I would." Vincent's answering smile was brilliant despite his exhaustion. He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers, and lifted it to his lips in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and perfect. "Then I'll take the job, and I'll court you properly, the way you deserve." He left to stable his horse and find his bed, and Aria returned to her weaving with fingers that shook slightly. She'd just agreed to let someone into her life, into the careful walls she'd built around her heart. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Over the next few weeks, Vincent proved as good as his word. He took the ranch job and settled into a more stable life, but he made time to see Aria whenever he could. They fell into a pattern of shared meals and long walks, of conversations that ranged from the profound to the silly. He brought her coffee when he came to town, and she made him socks from wool that wouldn't wear through as quickly as the store-bought kind. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building something real from the foundation of that first trade. Aria finished Mrs. Carpenter's commission and delivered it to praise and immediate payment. With actual money in her pocket, she was able to buy more materials and start building a small inventory. Word spread about her skill, and more orders came in. She was still far from prosperous, but she was surviving, even beginning to thrive. One evening, about 2 months after they'd first met, Vincent took her to a dance in the church hall. Aria had never been much for dancing, but in Vincent's arms, moving to the simple tunes played by local musicians, she felt something close to joy. They were surrounded by other couples, by the community slowly beginning to accept her as more than just a passing stranger. When the dance ended, Vincent walked her home under a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible. "I need to tell you something," Vincent said as they stood outside her door. "About my name." "What about it?" He looked uncomfortable. "Vincent Faulkner isn't my real name." "I mean, Vincent is my given name, but Faulkner isn't the name I was born with. That name belongs to the person I was in St. Louis, the son of a drunk who thought his fists were the solution to everything. When I left, I took my mother's maiden name instead, made myself new." Aria considered this. "What was your birth name? Does it matter?" "No, I suppose it doesn't." She understood the need to leave behind a painful past. "Vincent Faulkner is who you are now, that's what matters. I thought it might bother you, knowing I'd changed it. My name is all I have left of my mother." "It's precious to me." Aria touched his face gently. "You made your name mean something good. There's no shame in that." Vincent caught her hand and pressed it more firmly against his cheek. "I'm falling in love with you, Aria Morgan. I tried to keep things light, but I can't anymore. You're in my head and my heart, and I don't want you anywhere else." Aria's breath caught. She'd known, on some level, that her own feelings had deepened past simple affection. But hearing Vincent say the words out loud made them real in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "It scares me. Everything I've loved, I've lost. I know. I'm scared too, but I think maybe the risk is worth it." He kissed her then, not the chaste brush of lips he'd given her before, but a real kiss, deep and searching. Aria melted into it, her arms coming up around his neck, and for a moment, the whole world narrowed to just the two of them and the heat building between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I want a future with you." I don't have much to offer right now, but I'm saving my pay. Give me 6 months and I'll have enough for us to start something real. What kind of something? Whatever you want. A house, a shop, a life together. Maybe eventually a family if that's something you'd want. Aria thought about it, about what he was offering. Security, partnership, love. All the things she'd convinced herself she didn't need because wanting them had seemed like inviting disappointment. But standing there in Vincent's arms, she couldn't make herself push him away. 6 months, she agreed. We'll see where we both are in 6 months. They courted properly through the fall, and Tucumcari watched their relationship bloom with the interest small towns always showed in romance. Aria's weaving business continued to grow. She took on more commissions, started making other items besides blankets. Her skill became known throughout the territory, and sometimes people would travel from other towns specifically to buy her work. Vincent thrived in his new position. He was good with horses, patient and skilled, and the ranch owner came to rely on him. His savings grew, and with them, his confidence that he could offer Aria the life she deserved. They had their first real fight in November, a stupid argument about whether Aria should accept a commission from a rancher known for being difficult. Vincent thought it was too risky, that the man had a reputation for not paying. Aria felt like Vincent was trying to control her business decisions. They said sharp things to each other and parted angry, and Aria spent a miserable night convinced she'd ruined everything. Vincent appeared at her door the next morning with flowers he'd clearly picked himself and an apology ready on his lips. I was an ass. Your business is yours to run, and I had no right to tell you what to do. I was just worried about you getting hurt, but I said it all wrong. I was defensive, Aria admitted. I'm not used to someone caring about what happens to me. I took it as criticism when you meant it as concern. They made up, and the fight actually brought them closer. They learned that they could disagree and repair things, that anger didn't have to mean the end. It was a revelation for both of them, coming from families where conflict had meant violence or abandonment. Winter came to New Mexico with cold that made Aria grateful for the blankets she'd kept for herself. Vincent spent Christmas with her in her tiny room, and they exchanged simple gifts. She'd made him a coat from wool she'd dyed herself, thick and warm. He'd bought her a set of weaving needles, finer than anything she'd owned before, that must have cost him a week's wages. I love you, he said, as the year drew to a close. I think I've loved you since the first moment I saw you sitting there with your hands full of yarn, looking stubborn and proud and scared all at once. I love you too, Aria replied. You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have again. Hope. As January arrived and 1883 began, Vincent started talking more concretely about their future. He'd saved enough for a down payment on a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs. He wanted to marry her, wanted to build a life together that would be different from the loneliness they'd both known. One February evening, he took her to see the house. It was modest, just 3 rooms and in need of some repair, but it had good bones and a clear view of the mountains. Aria walked through it with Vincent following anxiously behind, and she could see their life taking shape in the empty rooms. Her weaving in one corner, a table they'd share for meals, a bed where they'd sleep wrapped in each other's arms. What do you think? Vincent asked. I think it's perfect. Perfect enough to marry me. Aria turned to face him and found him down on one knee, a simple gold band held in his work-roughened hand. Her heart felt too big for her chest. I know I'm just a cowboy without much to my name, Vincent said. But I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy. Aria Morgan, will you marry me? Will you let me take your name, the way I once took my mother's, and make it mean something good in this world? Tears were streaming down Aria's face, but she was smiling. "Take my name. You said it's all you have left of your mother, that it's precious to you. I want to be part of that. I want to be Vincent Morgan, husband to Aria Morgan, and build a life that honors where we both came from while making something new." It was perhaps the most romantic thing Aria had ever heard. Men didn't take their wives' names, not in this time and place, but Vincent was offering to do exactly that. He was willing to trade his chosen name for hers, to declare to the world that what they had was different, was special, was worth breaking convention for. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him fiercely. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, you can take my name. Yes to all of it." They married in March in a simple ceremony at the church with Mrs. Henderson and her husband standing as witnesses. Aria wore a new dress she'd traded blankets for, and Vincent wore his best shirt, and a look of such joy it made her want to laugh and cry at once. When the preacher asked for their names, Vincent said clearly, "Vincent Morgan," and Aria felt something settle into place deep in her soul. They moved into their little house and made it a home. Aria set up her weaving in the front room where the light was best, and Vincent built her shelves to store her materials. They learned each other's rhythms, the little habits and preferences that make up a shared life. Vincent liked his coffee strong and black. Aria needed quiet in the mornings before she could face conversation. They both slept better wrapped around each other than apart. The house needed work, and they did it together. Vincent fixed the roof, and Aria sewed curtains. They painted walls and planted a small garden. Every improvement felt like a declaration, a way of saying they were staying, they were building something that would last. Aria's business continued to grow. She was making more money than she ever had, enough that they weren't just surviving but actually saving. Vincent was promoted to foreman at the ranch, a position of responsibility that came with better pay. They talked about eventually buying their own land, maybe starting a small ranch combined with Aria's weaving business. In May, Aria realized she was pregnant. She'd been tired and queasy for weeks before she understood what it meant. When she told Vincent, he picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. His joy was incandescent, almost childlike in its purity. "A baby," he kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy about it?" Aria asked, suddenly nervous. They talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality was different from the idea. "Happy. Aria, I'm ecstatic. Terrified too, but mostly happy." Vincent knelt and placed his hands on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. Your mother and I already love you more than you can imagine." The pregnancy was mostly easy, though the summer heat made Aria miserable. Vincent fussed over her constantly, trying to take over her work until she threatened to brain him with her weaving shuttle. They compromised with Vincent doing the heavier tasks, while Aria continued her actual weaving from the comfort of a chair he'd modified to support her changing body. They argued about names endlessly, neither willing to use their father's names for obvious reasons. For a girl, they liked Clara or Rose. For a boy, they couldn't agree. Vincent wanted something strong. Aria wanted something that meant hope or joy. They finally settled on waiting to meet the baby before deciding. In December, on a cold night with snow threatening in the mountains, Aria went into labor. Vincent rode for the midwife in a panic while Mrs. Henderson stayed with Aria and tried to keep her calm. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Aria wasn't sure she'd survive it. But when the sun rose the next morning, she held a squalling baby boy with dark hair and a surprisingly loud voice for someone so small. Vincent was allowed in after the midwife and Mrs. Henderson had cleaned things up. He approached the bed like he was walking on sacred ground, his eyes locked on the bundle in Aria's arms. "A son," Aria said softly. "We have a son. He's perfect. You're perfect." Vincent sat carefully on the edge of the bed and touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger. The infant gripped it instinctively, and Vincent made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "What should we name him?" Aria looked at her husband, this good man who'd traded his name for hers, who'd shown her that love didn't have to mean pain. "Samuel, after the man who saved you." "Samuel Morgan." Vincent's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. He gave you the chance to become who you are. I want our son to carry that forward." They named their son Samuel Morgan, and he became the center of their world. Vincent was a devoted father, patient and gentle in ways his own father had never been. He'd walk the floor with Samuel for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in a low voice. Aria would watch them together and feel her heart expand with a love she hadn't known was possible. Life settled into a new rhythm. Aria's weaving time was more limited with a baby to care for, but her reputation was strong enough that she could afford to be selective about commissions. Vincent's work at the ranch continued to go well, and they were saving toward their dream of their own land. Samuel grew from infant to toddler with the alarming speed all children seem to possess. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn streak, and he brought chaos and joy into their orderly home. The little house rang with his laughter and occasional tears, and Aria couldn't imagine it any other way. When Samuel was 2, Aria discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news felt less shocking and more like a natural progression. Vincent was just as excited, though more outwardly calm, having been through it once before. "Maybe a girl this time," he said hopefully. "Maybe. Would you be disappointed if it's another boy? Not even a little. I just want you and the baby to be healthy." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1886, an easier birth than Samuel's had been. She was small and delicate, with wispy blonde hair that surprised them both until Aria remembered her mother had been fair. "Rose," Vincent said when he first held her. "She looks like a rose." "Rose Morgan," Aria agreed. "It's perfect." With 2 children, their house felt truly full. Samuel was initially skeptical of his baby sister, but he quickly became her fierce protector. Vincent built an addition onto the house, giving them more space, and Aria's weaving corner expanded into its own small room. The years passed in the way they do when life is good, each day blending into the next but somehow precious. Samuel started school. Rose learned to walk. Aria's weaving business remained steady, and Vincent was offered a partnership stake in the ranch where he worked. They bought their own land, a small plot with a spring and room for horses, and began planning their future in concrete terms. When Aria was 30, she looked around at her life and barely recognized it from the desperate woman who'd sat outside a general store trying to trade blankets for bread. She had a home, a business, a husband who loved her deeply, and 2 healthy children. It was more than she'd ever dreamed possible. "You remember that first day?" Vincent asked one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Samuel and Rose were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening air. "When I asked to trade for your blanket, of course. I thought you were trying to trick me somehow. And now I know you were just a good man offering help." Aria leaned into his side and his arm came around her automatically. "You changed my life, Vincent Morgan. You changed mine too. I was just drifting, existing but not really living. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something that would last. We built it together. We did. And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children play. Samuel was 5 now, tall for his age and curious about everything. Rose was 3, more cautious than her brother, but with a stubbornness that promised she'd never be pushed around. They were both being raised with love and security, given the childhood neither of their parents had known. The territory around them was changing. New Mexico was becoming more settled, less wild, though it retained its rough edges. Towns were growing. The railroad brought more people and goods. Progress marched forward whether anyone wanted it to or not. But in their little corner of Tucumcari, Vincent and Aria had created something timeless. Their love story, begun with a simple trade, had grown into something neither of them could have predicted. The weaver who'd been bartering blankets for bread had found security and purpose. The cowboy who'd traded his name for hers had found a home and family. As the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Vincent pulled Aria closer and kissed the top of her head. "I love you," he said, as he did nearly every day. "My life began the day I met you." "I love you too," Aria replied. "Thank you for seeing me when I needed to be seen." "Thank you for staying." "Always," Vincent promised. "For as long as I live, I'm staying right here with you." And he did. They grew old together in that house on the edge of Tucumcari, watching their children grow and eventually give them grandchildren. Samuel became a teacher, patient and kind like his father. Rose took after her mother, learning to weave and eventually taking over Aria's business as arthritis made the work harder for aging hands. Vincent worked the ranch he part-owned until his body told him it was time to slow down, and then he spent his days helping Aria with her business and playing with his grandchildren. They never became wealthy in monetary terms, but they were rich in the ways that mattered. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Vincent took Aria back to the spot where he'd first approached her outside the general store. The building was different now, expanded and modernized, but the memory remained crystal clear for both of them. "I knew that day," Vincent said. "When I saw you sitting there with your yarn and your stubborn expression, I knew you were going to matter to me. I was just trying to survive. And you did. You survived and thrived and built something beautiful. I'm so proud of you, Aria." "We built it together," she corrected. "Everything good in my life came from that first moment you offered to help. You could have walked by. Most people would have. I couldn't. You pulled at something in me, made me want to be better than I'd been. You still do." They kissed there on the street. Two middle-aged people who'd weathered storms and celebrated joys together. Some younger folks walked by and smiled at the older couple showing affection, not knowing the full story of how a weaver bartering blankets and a cowboy willing to trade his name had found each other and built a life of remarkable love. More years passed. Their children gave them more grandchildren. Vincent's hair went white, and Aria's hands became gnarled with age, but their love remained constant. They'd learned each other so completely over the decades that they could communicate without words, could anticipate needs before they were spoken. When Vincent was 63, he grew ill. The doctor couldn't say exactly what was wrong, just that his body was wearing out the way bodies do. He spent his last months in the house he'd bought for Aria all those years ago, surrounded by family, his hand clasped in his wife's. No regrets. Aria asked him one afternoon as they sat together. "Not a single one. You gave me the best life I could have imagined. A home, children, purpose, love. So much love, Aria. I've been blessed beyond measure." "You're not gone yet, don't talk like you are. I know. But I want you to know, while I still can say it clearly, you were my miracle. The best decision I ever made was talking to you that day. Taking your name was the second best decision. Everything good in my life came from you." Aria was crying, but she smiled through the tears. "The same is true for me. You saved me in every way a person can be saved." Vincent lived another 6 months, long enough to see one more spring come to New Mexico. When he finally passed, it was peacefully in his sleep with Aria beside him. She held his hand and told him she loved him, and she hoped, wherever he was going, Samuel Rivers was there to greet him. The funeral was well attended. Vincent Morgan had become a respected member of the community over his decades in Tucumcari. But it was Samuel, their son, who gave the eulogy that captured who his father truly was. "My father was born Vincent Faulkner," Samuel said, "but he chose to become Vincent Morgan, taking my mother's name as his own in an act of love that defined their entire relationship. He was a man who understood that family is what we make it, that names carry the weight we give them, and that love is the only thing that truly matters. He taught me to be kind, to work hard, and to cherish the people who matter. I'll miss him every day for the rest of my life." Aria lived another 15 years after Vincent's death, long enough to see automobiles become common and airplanes take to the sky. The world changed dramatically, but she remained rooted in her little house in Tucumcari, still weaving though her output was small. Her children and grandchildren visited often, and she told them stories about the old days, about the Wild West that was tamed during her lifetime. She spoke often of Vincent, keeping his memory alive with tales of his kindness and strength. The grandchildren who'd never known him learned about the cowboy who traded his name for their grandmother's, who'd shown through action that love means sacrifice and commitment. When Aria finally died at the age of 82, she was buried next to Vincent in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Tucumcari. Her gravestone read, "Aria Morgan, beloved mother and grandmother, master weaver." Next to her, Vincent's stone said, "Vincent Morgan, beloved father and grandfather, a good man." Their children and grandchildren gathered at the graveside, multiple generations who existed because a weaver bartering blankets and a cowboy with a good heart had found each other in 1882. The family was large and prosperous, carrying forward the legacy of love and determination their matriarch and patriarch had established. Rose, now in her 50s and still weaving, placed one of her mother's finest blankets over the casket before it was lowered into the ground. It seemed fitting that Aria Morgan should be buried with an example of the craft that had sustained her, that had brought her to Tucumcari and ultimately to Vincent. As the family walked back to their cars afterward, Samuel took his sister's hand. They were both gray-haired now, grandparents themselves, but in that moment they were just children again, missing their parents. "They loved each other so much," Rose said softly. "They did. And they showed us what love should look like, how it should sustain and support, not diminish or destroy." "I hope they're together now. Wherever they are," Samuel nodded. "I'm sure they are. Some loves are too strong to be separated by something as simple as death." The sun was setting over Tucumcari, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The town had grown over the decades, but it still retained some of its frontier character. And on a hill overlooking it all, Vincent and Aria Morgan rested side by side, their love story complete but never forgotten. Their great-grandchildren would someday tell the story to their own children, about how a woman desperate enough to barter blankets for bread, and a man willing to trade his name for hers, had created a legacy of love that spanned generations. It was a tale of the Old West, of hardship and survival, but more than that, it was a story about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful from almost nothing. The weaver had bartered blankets for bread, trading her skill for survival. The cowboy had traded his name for hers, declaring his love in the most permanent way he knew. And together, they'd created a life that proved love, real love, was worth any price. In the end, theirs was a simple story but a profound one. Two lonely people had found each other in a harsh land and decided to stop being lonely together. They'd worked hard, raised their children well, and loved each other deeply for over 4 decades. They'd argued and made up, struggled and celebrated, weathered storms both literal and figurative. They'd started with almost nothing, just determination and hope and the willingness to take a chance on something as fragile and powerful as love. From that foundation, they'd built everything, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from the simplest moments, from small acts of kindness that bloom into something extraordinary. Vincent Morgan and Aria Morgan's love story became legend in their family, passed down as an example of what marriage should be. Not always easy, not always simple, but always rooted in mutual respect and genuine affection. They'd chosen each other every day, even when that choice was difficult, and in doing so, they'd created something that lasted far beyond their own lifetimes. The town of Tucumcari continued to change with the times, but there on the hill, 2 headstones stood as a testament to a love that had endured. Visitors to the cemetery sometimes paused at the matching graves, noting the identical last name and the dates that showed a long life lived together. They didn't know the full story, but they could sense something significant in those simple markers. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew across the New Mexico hills and the sky turned the colors of fire, you could almost imagine 2 spirits walking hand in hand, still together in death as they'd been in life. The weaver and the cowboy, bound together by love and choice, their story complete but never truly ending, for love like theirs doesn't end. It transforms, living on in children and grandchildren, in the stories told and retold, in the example set for future generations. Vincent and Aria Morgan had started with a simple trade, blankets for food, and from that beginning, they'd woven something far more valuable than any physical goods. They'd woven a life together, thread by careful thread, creating a tapestry of love that would endure long after they were gone. And in doing so, they'd proven that the best things in life can't be bought or sold but only grown through patience, dedication, and the willingness to give your name, your heart, and your life to the person you love. The sun set fully over Tucumcari, and the stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had witnessed Vincent and Aria's first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children, and all the countless small moments that made up their extraordinary ordinary life. The story was complete, the circle closed, and 2 people who'd started with nothing but each other had everything that truly mattered in the end.